future set of activities you have going between your university and Afghanistan. I'm really thrilled to be involved. As you had mentioned, I am a historian. I, though, am very much a newcomer in my self-estimation to visual studies. But in my brief engagement of the visual history of Afghanistan, I must say there are abundant sources, very little of which has been analyzed. And so to give you a sense of what I see the future to be, 5 to 10 PhD theses are possible on the visual history of Afghanistan. Let me just set that bar at that height for the moment. And maybe, Genevieve, may I please share my screen? I will make an attempt. Please let me know if I have achieved sharing status.
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint presentation now.
Okay. So I definitely appreciated the pamphlet or brochure, small book that Genevieve and Fatima produced, now online. I'm so happy to see. And I really enjoyed learning something about their background and work together, as well as that of the artists. And what I came immediately away from reading is thinking about the relationship between power and resistance in visual terms. And so what I plan to do here today is to build upon the perspective that environmental history has given me. And that is something that takes us back deeper in time than the nation state era, and in a wider geography than nation state territories tend to incorporate. So with the environmental history of Afghanistan in mind, I should say that we will be going very, very deep in time to begin our visual survey, dating back to approximately 8,000 BC. And we will make our way to the present, which is approximately 10,000 years of coverage here in just a short amount of time. So we'll be sporadic in our coverage, but episodically intense with the colonial and national periods, I think more directly. So when it comes to art and power, we need to talk about certain kinds of art and certain kinds of power. And what we're speaking of here is visual arts, the visual arts. And in that regard, we, in this presentation and context, will be covering photography, certainly, but also lithography and sketching and maps and frescoes and posters and leaflets, and a really wide visual repertoire. Similarly, when it comes to power, there are various kinds of power: local, national, and it's imperial power and national power that are our sort of rubrics. And what I want to sort of emphasize is that empires take many forms. We've heard of informal and former empires, for example. States take many forms, strong states and weak states. And in the production of visual material, states and empires rely on certain formats, certain motifs that set the framework for any resistance to those forms of power, to those images. And so the question we have to wrestle with is that of the extent to which imperial visual cultures are resistible visually, whether they're resistible by locals or imperial actors themselves, whether that resistance takes the form of, shall we call, reform of an imperial system. So tweak the images or the formats or the motifs, or is it revolutionary resistance to undo the structures of power that give rise to the visual culture in question? So we have a wide sort of scope of visual arts, a wide scope of political power to integrate and frame our understanding of resistance. And these are broadly then the rough chronology that we will cover with a spatiality that's both local throughout the territory of Afghanistan, interregional across the surrounding regions, and let's be very clear artistically and culturally that Afghanistan is a product of its surroundings in India and Persia and the Turkish world of Central Asia. And it responds to those stimuli artistically and culturally as well. So we will be moving very fast. I'm sorry to confess my addiction to PowerPoint, and I've got, I certainly have more images than we need, but maybe we can come back to some of them in the conversation. So we begin with the images on the top, which are, according to some, the oldest human face in the world, a form of art. And this is a small pebble, a couple inches tall and a little over an inch in width. Very small, but most people agree it resembles a face. And this has been celebrated as the oldest face. Life magazine, for example, conveyed this to be the oldest face on record, from Akkupruk in northern Afghanistan. And this is not necessarily an imperial product. It's a local product, but it was discovered and circulated and advertised in an imperial context, I'd like to argue, through the agency of Louis Dupree, through the agency of the University of Pennsylvania, and ultimately the discipline of archaeology. And we'll come back to Louis Dupree and US imperial interests at the end of the presentation. Below that here are two of the most famous artistic images of Afghanistan from the period between roughly the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. On the left is a plate from Ai Khanum, and on the right is a crown from Tilya Tepe. That get us into a kind of ancient imperial frame of reference. Clearly, there are imperial ingredients in the object on the left, perhaps less so with the crown, but we don't see a lot of scope for resistance to these images in the sort of material itself or the context. One thing I will say about this exhibition that's very much celebrated as the Bactrian Hoard Afghan Gold exhibition, that it's generally external actors, glass from Egypt, images from the Mediterranean. There's not a lot of attention to local indigenous, shall we say, Afghan or proto-Afghan actors here. Now I want to move to what we can call broadly the Buddhist period, anchored in the Bamiyan Valley, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with visually or perhaps experientially, but also Gandhara. And Gandhara is it's a cultural expression, kind of like the Renaissance, perhaps in European artistic terms, centered in the Peshawar Valley, but very much incorporating Buddhism. And I'd like to make a distinction between the two forms. And what we see in Bamiyan is a great deal of mosaic and frescoes, old artistic work inside the Buddha's caves. And these are images from the pre-explosion. And one of them has been kind of touched up here. But the sort of repertoire of images is quite fluid. There are dynamic sort of fluid views of the Buddha, for example, and perhaps in that dynamism is the scope for resistance. In Gandhara, we don't have visual, shall we say, paintings, but more sculpture and material cultural evidence. And what you can see from Gandharan art samples here is a synthesis of Mediterranean motifs in the sense, if you can just follow my laser pointer here, we see what appeared to be very much a Buddhist hand gesture, and a sort of global synthesis of artistic forms. The production of these things and their circulation takes us beyond the mere visuality that differs from Bamiyan, both of which are heavily inflected by Buddhist iconography in a very permeable way. We come now to the Persianate period, from roughly 1000 to roughly 1750. And by Persianate, what I want to focus on is the Ghaznavid Empire, that is Mahmud of Ghazna, anchored in the city of Ghazni or Ghazna, eastern Afghanistan, where the poet Ferdowsi was patronized. And Ferdowsi created what we think of as modern Persian. Modern Persian, that is the Persian language written with the Arabic script, in a way that is of enduring significance through a text called the Shahnameh, the world's largest epic poem. This poem has been the basis of poetic, artistic, historical, and literary development in the Persian world since then. And the Shahnameh, the text that Ferdowsi wrote, was abundantly illustrated about 500 years later in the Safavid Empire, when the Safavid Shah Tahmasp patronized the illumination of the Shahnameh. So we have about 250, if you could please follow my laser pointer on the left, about 250 of these lavishly illustrated, artistically so rich scenes from the Shahnameh. This is a scene in Safavid Iran, in Isfahan, where the Shah Tahmasp is receiving the Mughal emperor Humayun, who sought refuge in Safavid Iran before returning to the Mughal India to reclaim the throne he had lost. This is a significant moment in the movement of Persian cultural material in the form of artists and artisans following Humayun back to Mughal India. And it's in Mughal India where the Mughal ruler Akbar also illuminated the Shahnameh, but also the text called the Baburnameh, the kind of biography of the founder of the Mughal Empire, Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, buried in Kabul. The Shahnameh has a very famous, probably the most famous story in the text of Rostam and Sohrab. Rostam is a king from what is Zabulistan in Sistan, historically, Afghanistan today, whose mother is from Kabul. And the point here is that the geography of Afghanistan is written into the Shahnameh and illustrated in the Shahnameh. And we have the story of Rostam and Sohrab, where Rostam, having been a proven warrior, loses his horse, Raksh, and in retrieving the horse, ends up at the king of Samangan's palace, where his daughter, Tahmina, and Rostam generate a son, Sohrab, who ends up in battle with Rostam. And the battle between Rostam and his son, Sohrab, ends with Rostam killing Sohrab and not realizing the mortal wounds until the end. It's a very, very famous component of the Shahnameh, richly illustrated, involving Afghanistan directly. On the right, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir lost the city of Kandahar to the Safavids, Shah Abbas. Jahangir had a dream about kind of retrieving Kandahar from Shah Abbas. And this dream has also been illuminated, if you can see down in the right-hand corner. One of the most famous Persianate manuscripts from the Mughal Empire, again, intimately involving Afghanistan, remind us Babur made his name as a conqueror born in Kabul, Humayun born in Kabul, Kandahar, a site of contest between the Mughals and Safavids. The Baburnama itself is such a rich repository of environmental information. You can almost smell the trees and hear the wind and feathers from birds, the animals, the rivers, the mountains, the climate. It's a tribute to the environmental history of Afghanistan, the Baburnama. So wonderfully illustrated. Let me just quickly state that the origin of this Persian miniature tradition ultimately it involves China and Chinese miniatures through the agency of the Mongols. For our purposes, it's the artist Behzad from Herat, who mastered miniature, the science of miniature painting. And Behzad became incorporated in the Safavid atelier and became the director of the illumination of the Shahnama. European powers were interested in our Persianate world beginning in the 1600s and left visual records of that interest in the form of maps. This is in the middle, a map by Ortelius that has artistic value, as well as a geographic value, because if you will be able to see, Kandahar is north of Kabul in this rendition here. I will leave the other European maps of this region, and including Afghanistan, perhaps for discussion, but they are a treasure trove of visual material. Moving now into the 18th century, the early 1800s, where we have Durrani political elites in the kingdom of Kabul patronizing visual images. On the top is a set of visuals, kind of a spiritual map of Kabul and Afghanistan in a tazkira of Shah Mahmud from the 18th century, now held at Amherst College. And I thank Yale Rice, who has written considerably on Mughal imperial visual production, Yale Rice. On the bottom is a map of Shah Zaman, another exiled Durrani's mobile camp, where we see, again, a kind of cartographic layout of various individuals and both historical and geographical reference here. Maybe not worth a full thesis, but let's say a master's thesis could be generated out of that if I could push the agenda. We have made it to the modern era. We have made it to colonialism, and we have a great broadening of materials to consider now very quickly, beginning with British imperial visual material. Drawings, sketches, maps, and ultimately photographs. But we need to begin with the brief history, that is Mount Stuart Elphinstone being at the court of Shah Mahmud in Peshawar in 1809, getting a treaty of friendship from the Afghan ruler that really sets the stage of engagement culturally, politically, artistically, between Afghan elites and British imperial actors. This leads to the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839 to 1842 that has another treasure trove of visual material for us. And then the Second Anglo-Afghan War from 1878 to 1880 that also generated another repertoire, another layer of material in the form of photography. Initially, though, the concern for travelers after Elphinstone in the 1820s and 30s was archaeology. And let's remember that empires are concerned with history, with a time frame. Empires insert themselves into local chronologies and then mix up those chronologies to their own benefit. as we'll see in a second. So ancient history was tapped into archaeologically after it had been tapped into linguistically. And what the colonial actors, the early colonial actors, bring a large set of knowledge formations: linguistic, artistic, scientific, military, and political, to bear on their activities and visual cultural production. Ultimately, in the First War, we get kind of an ethnography, and I'd like to go through some of these images now. Leading up to the First War, a traveler named G.T. Vine, V-I-G-N-E, passed through Kabul and its environments and left a series of illustrations that are now at the Victoria and Albert Museum and online. And these are examples of that. And they highlight the Persianate history of Afghanistan with the clubs that it's from the Zurkhana tradition of Iranian gymnastics tradition. The image of Dost Muhammad and his family and allies highlight the role of the Qizilbash in Afghanistan. Dost Muhammad and Shah Shuja were cycled back and forth in the context of the First War through British agency as rulers in Kabul. And while in Calcutta, Dost Muhammad had his portrait drawn. This is not from Godfrey Thomas Vine in the upper right. That's from colonial India. Elphinstone's book is published first in 1815, and it carries a series of visuals, a kind of ethnography, a visual ethnography that is not produced by Elphinstone, but ultimately artists from Delhi who took their skills to build a repertoire of certain kind of personality and image types for Elphinstone's book that got recycled, manipulated, and transformed in the process of colonial imperial visual cultural production. Elphinstone's map is what we need to focus on, and Elphinstone's map is a part of a larger set of maps, a kind of cartographic repertoire of visual images that the British brought to bear on India, Afghanistan, and the world. This is Elphinstone's map that is not a map of Afghanistan, but a map of the Kingdom of Kabul. This is not a map that Elphinstone created alone, but it's a map created on the basis of data collected during his mission to visit Shah Mahmud in Peshawar, not Kabul. Elphinstone wrote a book and drew a map of Kabul, never having been there, highlighting the role of local mediation for colonial knowledge, whether it's artistic, linguistic, or geographic. This map is important for presenting an image of the Kingdom of Kabul and Afghanistan using a methodology that shows some topography, that is mountain ranges and rivers in a limited way, but it's by using smaller or bigger letters, whether they're bold or italic, spread together for a location, spread apart for a tribal group, or spread way apart to indicate a political frame of reference. Khorasan, the Kingdom of Kabul, indeed Afghanistan is etched on this map. But the methodology does not respect borders very much. It's a kind of overlapping. It's hard to find the Kingdom of Kabul here. I will quickly show you. The Kingdom of Kabul is written across here, Kingdom of Kabul, going up to Kashmir. Afghanistan kind of follows a different trajectory, but wraps around the geography in a way that's different than Khorasan. Khorasan being the master, largest set of letters. We find Kabul itself in very small letters here, Kandahar, etc. This is a map Elphinstone produced on the basis of a map by Lieutenant John McCartney, who was the chief surveyor, the official mapper of the mission. Elphinstone's map is for popular consumption, printed in his book and circulated. The map that McCartney produced, the official mapper of the mission, using the same data as Elphinstone used, looks entirely different, functions entirely differently than Elphinstone's map, but it was used by this, it was based on the same information. Now, what Elphinstone did in his book, 800 pages, and we must always remember to situate an image in a larger text. We must remember to situate images against other images, text within a larger set of texts, giving a larger context for the image and the text itself. Now, what Elphinstone did was frame the kingdom of Kabul as one where Pashtuns dominate. Elphinstone goes through cartographic and textual lengths to position Pashtuns and Pashto at the cultural core of the Afghan nation centered on Kabul. McCartney takes an entirely different view. His map is not a small map. It's a map that goes across cafeteria-sized tables. People walked around it. It's a strategic map. It's in the archives. It's not a map of Kabul or Afghanistan. It's a map of the countries west of the Indus. It's not a map that uses large and small letters spread across the text. It's a map that uses codes, little Roman numerals, that whether they're colored or not is how the geography, the sociology, and the political formations on this map are represented. You see greater attention to boundaries here than in Elphinstone's map. And the epistemological resistance to Elphinstone is that McCartney does not consider Pashtuns, or all Pashtuns certainly, to be at the core, let alone even a part of the Afghan nation, or the people we call Afghans. This is a map of the Punjab and countries west of the Indus, and we see Duranis and Ghilzais, the major Pashtun tribes, according to some, separately mapped, separately categorized than Afghans. So imperialism is powerful. It has structures, it has texts, but it's full of inconsistencies, contradictions, gaps, and limitations that form the area of resistance to those imperial texts and images and forms of power. Coming to the later 1800s, we get, as Fatima does so nicely in her introduction, the reference to the photos of Abdurrahman in 1869, taken in exile in the now Russian Central Asian republics. We also have a photo in 1969 taken of Amir Sher Ali in Ambala. So 1869 marks a very important date. Photographs of Afghan elites outside of Afghanistan. And this marks then the use of photographs by these Afghan elites. But again, the circulation seems to be for imperial consumption, not local consumption. Here's a photograph of Sher Ali at his Ambala Durbar. The Second Anglo-Afghan War begins with a sort of treaty signed by the Amir Yaqub Sher Ali's son at Gandamak. That's captured here. And what we have in the Second War is what print historians call an incunabula between sort of sketches and drawings and paintings and photography. And we see actually the process here of making the photograph that appears on the left. Notice this camera. This is what we need to consider as an Afghan box camera that we'll come back to in just a second. The first Afghan war has two primary photographers, John Burke, who photographed things in the belt between Peshawar and Kabul, hundreds of photographs all online, ready to analyze. And Benjamin Simpson took photos in Kandahar. We will see some images now of John Burke in and around Kabul. Various communities mustered together, gathered together at the behest of imperial power. It's Burke's association with the Second Invasion Force that allows him to create these photos of the Kabul population. Various types of laborers, actors, secretaries, bankers, wonderful material for students. Omar Khan has a book called From Kashmir to Kabul that utilizes a lot of these images. They are informative for the material cultural surroundings of Kabul. The sartorial history of Afghanistan can be written through these images. The first Anglo-Afghan War also brought the sappers and miners into the photographic business. And this is the interior of the machine khana, or Kabul workshops, that demonstrate high levels of European industrial technologies. A fire engine from what is sort of the British Midlands photographed. These are pictures of sacred, important historical sites in Kandahar from Simpson. Historic, ancient Kandahar, burnt by Alexander the Chilzina, Ahmad Shah's tomb, and the Ziyarat-e-Hirka Sharif, the cloak of the Holy Prophet shrine. All of which, each location we can say much more about. The next photographer is Lilias Hamilton, who comes to Afghanistan as Abdurrahman's nurse, an eye doctor also. How she got there is mysterious, but she brought a camera and she took photos of the palace and elites, as well as the local populations out from the palace in the streets of Kabul. She wrote a lot. She wrote a novel called The Vizier's Daughter, with a V, not a W, contrary to Afghan pronunciation. The point is that that book is full of Orientalist representations of Afghan women, never having a moment of happiness, literally their whole life, which is belied, contradicted by an image of apparently a happy mother and daughter. And I think it is possible for Afghan women to be happy in degrees, just as all humans have that potential. The Second Anglo-Afghan War also generated images that traveled globally. These traveled back to England as part of a board game. We see the industrial technologies of the telegraph and the Gatling gun brought to bear on Afghanistan in that context. We also see a movement during the late 19th century of things related to Afghanistan and Kabul in particular, making their way to British India. And the famous Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore wrote the Kabuliwala in 1892 or 3, I believe, that has subsequently been captured in its historical residue by Muska Najib through the website Kabul to Calcutta, where the descendants of the fictive Kabuliwala are photographed in real time, that is, in the recent years. So again, what the visual sources for Afghans in India offers is just so rich. It's another multiple theses, let me say. The Americans get involved in Afghanistan in the early 20th century. The first is an engineer named A.C. Jewett, who helped bring electricity to the palace in Kabul and Jalalabad primarily. He took photographs, again, a sort of visual ethnography of laborers and officials in his writings, both books and articles. A.C. Jewett. national photography begins with, in substance, although photography existed before 1919, it began primarily for our purpose with independence and the reign of Amanullah. And what independence did for Afghanistan is not grant sort of freedom in any way. It actually increased earlier forms of dependency and brought new actors into play, rather than just the British, the French, and the Germans in particular begin to have a huge hand in the production of images in Afghanistan. And these French-produced postcards of Amanullah's reign are most widely circulated, available online through the Fototeca Afghanica. And Genevieve can send out links to all of this material for you. The curator of that website is Paul Dieter Bushi, who is really the expert on these things. But we see here in Mussoorie, the peace conference and the actors involved, and again, their sartorial habits are one thing. The posters celebrate the satellite capital city, very much like an Indian hill station, such as Mussoorie, of Pagman. Pagman, a few kilometers east of Kabul, in a very lush valley where Amanullah dedicated a majority of state resources to building a set of imperial architecture that is replete with imitations of the Arc de Triomphe and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and very much along the lines of European aesthetics. The point is that Amanullah, the individual independent Afghan king, is actually now overtly reproducing colonial motifs. And the accoutrements of independence, that is independence fairs and festivals in Afghanistan known as Jashan-e-Istiqlal, Jashan is our word, where we start to get the kinds of parades and public festivals that mark modern Independence Day celebrations in the West. This is where his wife, Soraya, appeared unveiled. That is the real photographic a moment that most historians and actors focus on, is Soraya's veil. But there's much more going on with agricultural fairs at these Jeshans in Pagman. All of this stuff is available online for you. There's a series of photographs taken by the king's brother Inayatullah, who becomes Khalilullah Inayat Siraj, thousands of photographs that are in bulk at the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University that again reveal all the Europeans, individuals that are now involved in Afghanistan, as well as the sort of conduct with drinking and costume balls, where the Afghan king, instead of wearing his military uniform as he likes, dresses up as a tribal actor. This self-orientalization is what's going on here. These are images from inside the palace environs, where the Tarzi family and their Ottoman, sort of Ottomanized European Germanic aesthetic influences come to bear. Thousands of photographs of the interior spaces. Schools and students that get sent abroad are photographed. The ruling elite, the Mohammedzai clan, is photographed in whole. These are the rulers of Afghanistan in the late teens at Babur's grave. A few dozen families. The most significant photographic episode is when the jirga. Amanullah develops a constitution validated through a jirga, as we see in current history, but the representatives in the jirga are kind of paid to come, given stipends and travel allowances, and here they are photographed in primarily their local garb. But part of the deal of being a state representative at the jirga is that you have to do what the jirga wants. And the clothing transformations that are captured here are astounding for the Europeanization of visual practice for Amanullah and the Afghan elite. However, remember our box camera from the Second War. This technology also has entered Afghanistan, like so many other technologies, outdated. Technologies that get outdated elsewhere get sent to Afghanistan. And this box camera remains relevant today in the streets of Afghanistan. It offers a very different level of a popular street level use of photography, a different technology, different purposes, different results, different circulations. There's a history of this box camera. There's a website about the Afghan box camera that traces it ultimately to Indian actors and the Indian connection. These are photographs by the American in the early 1920s, invited or sent Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas, the American, some say father of American journalism, globally famous for making Sir Lawrence of Arabia a global celebrity. But Lowell Thomas and his cameraman, Harry Chase, brought their car to Afghanistan, Kabul, and took pictures that are online at Harvard and available. And they are useful, but it is a wider internationalization of international photographic access. The National Geographic magazine itself, so famous in the 1980s for the Afghan girl cover, is publishing photos of Afghanistan from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. A German spy named Niedermeyer came to Afghanistan in the early 1920s and took photos of the whole country. And I'm just showing you a wooden architecture in Kabul from Niedermeyer here. The move from sort of brick and wood architecture to cement and steel in Kabul is visually documented and worth a thesis. The French, these are images from French work at the copper mine now, Mes Aynak, near Kabul, Logar in Kabul. But these images here are from the early French archaeological work that began in the early 1920s in Bamiyan and gradually extended into Hada, for example. And the French archaeological mission, DAFA is the acronym. Thousands of photographs of Bamiyan, Hada in the 1920s, and now Mes Aynak, getting back to the Buddhist heritage. The Germans were interested in the 1930s in Afghanistan intimately because of Aryan origin theories. And again, we have to think of the Nazis sending archaeologists to the Hindu Kush to look for the original plant foods that the original Nazis or Aryans would have eaten. And here we have, through this photograph of the Deutsch Hindu Kush expedition of 1935, all kinds of images of Nuristan in particular and wooden architecture. The Americans come into Afghanistan in the Cold War period, late 1940s, in the 50s, and intensively in the 60s and 70s for primarily the Helmand Valley Development Project, which brings the Morrison Knudsen Corporation as the primary contractor for that project over many decades, with many millions of dollars of US taxpayer money, hundreds, if not thousands of Americans in Afghanistan. A corporate magazine known as the MKN, available online, has images of that work that are informative about the technologies and the actors and the locations of that Helmand Valley Development Project. The American State Department began to deploy photography religiously, so to speak, as a tool of power in the 1950s and 60s, where there are thousands of photographs of digestions each year from the 60s and 70s that give so much information. Afghanistan, in fact, is dependent on the Morrison Knudsen Company and indeed the Fairchild Mapping Survey Corporation of California for the first aerial surveys of Afghanistan, now air power. And it's aerial mapping that the Fairchild Corporation did for the Morrison Knudsen Corporation that entered Afghanistan's national cartographic production. The Afghan state in the 50s and 60s made maps of itself using information and visuals from the Americans. The greatest threat to the integrity of Afghanistan was the Pashtunistan issue that is replete with a set of histories and visual contexts and geopolitical initiatives that generate a map, a separate flag for Pashtunistan, all a part of the tensions within national visual imagery, be it with the map or the flag, or indeed the ethnic map. The ethnic map took shape under the auspices of Louis Dupree, who arrived in Afghanistan concurrent with the Morrison Knudsen Corporation, concurrent with the geopolitical threat that Pashtunistan posed. And Louis Dupree got to Afghanistan in the 1940s, actually, and stayed to the 1970s, indeed 80s, actively. Decades of activity in Afghanistan. Louis Dupree is responsible for creating the ethnic map that was produced through local collaborators, including none other than the president of Afghanistan, then Ashraf Ghani, as a student. This is the ethnic map, perhaps the most ubiquitous map of Afghanistan, produced, but then recirculated and produced by Dupree and recycled. Louis Dupree is a curious representative of empire because he was a professor with really no students, no PhDs produced under Louis Dupree's direction, although he served on all PhD committees about Afghanistan, and there's not that many of them. The anthropologists who wrote those theses were patronized and really sort of a product of Louis Dupree's gatekeeper role. Louis Dupree was not just a scholar, an unusual scholar with an unusual appointment. He was an intelligence officer, in some degree provided information in a sort of intelligence capacity to the CIA. And in that sense, he became very active in the policies and politics and practical considerations involved in generating the Afghan Mujahideen. Here you see him photographed with the Mujahideen. Not a comfortable look for an anthropologist. The ethnic map that Dupree produced was militarily instrumentalized after 9/11. And you can see immediately, ethnic groups became the basis of imperial warfare in Afghanistan after 9/11, and we'll come back to that. But we need to step back in time quickly to Afghan national production. Again, Fatima addresses the production of identity papers, the tezkira, in Afghanistan. But like photographs in the 1930s, where the Afghan state is photographing itself and the international community is photographing Afghanistan, there's textual production. New texts in Afghanistan modeled on European almanacs, the Salnama series in Kabul, various societies, Anjumani Adabi, the literary society, the Pashto Tolana, the sort of Pashto association, generate documents, identity tezkira from the 1940s and one from the 1950s, where photographs are inserted and Pashto is inserted. Again, Pashto in the heading of the document, but the writing in Persian. Pashto has never been equally represented, although it's a national language in Afghanistan. It's been subordinated to Persian and Persianate culture, period. in Afghanistan, I'd like to argue now. The Afghan artist Abdul Ghaffur Breshna, the German-trained Afghan artist sent to Germany in 1921, stayed for 10 years learning art, came back to Afghanistan in 1932, and began generating the images of Afghan historical figures based upon his Germanic romantic training. And we can see on all the male images a distinctly Persianate look, a very similar Persianate look, besides the facial hair, to these actors. Actors ranging from Ibn Sina, the sort of polymath scientist from Central Asia, Saadi Shirazi, the Persian poet from the 12th and 13th century, Sher Shah Suri, the Afghan so-called Pashtun ruler that interrupted the Mughal rule in India, Mahmud Ghaznavi, Mir Wais Hotak, Shah Mahmud Hotak, Khushal Khan Hatak, the Pashto poet, all presented through the pen of a German-trained, European-inspired Afghan artists. It's his imagination, Breshna, that creates the visual history for Afghanistan, notwithstanding the timeless Kuchi girl that stands outside of time. Breshna in 1943, in the book Ahmad Shah, Babay Afghan, written by Mir Ghulam Gobar, gives us the image of the coronation of Ahmad Shah Abdali, who becomes Durrani and the leader of the Afghan polity. It's Breshna's image that we have to work with as an Afghan nation. The Afghan state marketed itself through photography produced in Japan as a kind of tourist haven. And Afghanistan is a part of the international hippie trail, and the art that brought is worth studying as well. The Soviet invasion of 1979 generated a visual repertoire of Soviet posters of Afghanistan, celebrating land tenure literacy, labor, sort of intellectuals. We have posters and leaflets, Soviet produced, primarily in Pashto, but also Persian. And it's a sort of battleground, because as the Soviets were producing visual imagery to advance their interests in Afghanistan, so too were the Americans and Louis Dupree, in fact. And these are posters, the 6 on the left from Louis Dupree's personal collection, the 2 on the right are from my collection. Imagery of the Mujahideen produced in Peshawar through American and indeed, on the other side, Iranian influences. A vast Mujahideen visual repertoire of the Soviet invasion. Again, highlighting the corruption of Babrak Karmal and Najibullah, Brezhnev's own cultural corruption, and again, sort of the production of global jihad here through these images. The Americans after 9/11 also used a lot of leaflets that are really important, and posters for the American visual imperium that I would like to draw to your attention. And now we come back to clothing and Afghan rulers. Hamid Karzai, the elected president through the Loya Jirga, for whatever that's worth democratically, wore one costume. And I was in a room at Columbia University with Karzai where it got hot. And he had to say, "Excuse me, may I please take this off?" And the little kind of coat man came and he said to a group of people, "They make me wear this thing. What is this thing? This chapan, this karakul hat?" Well, this is a strategic US imperial outfit that was given for Karzai to wear. And I'm going to hypothesize that it's Thomas Gutierrez, the scholar slash government actor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, that's responsible for this. And maybe his colleague, John Schroeder, had an eye in this. Karzai did not ask for this uniform. Next president, again, equally controversial election. However, it is leading to a sort of bifurcated. I know there's another ruler here, Abdullah, not focused, who wears one suit. Ghani will wear anything you give him as a Western trained intellectual. And I think his clothing is worth paying attention to. In 1910, the Afghan state itself, the Ministry of Culture, with the help of the Aga Khan Institute and the British Library, produced a pamphlet celebrating the colonial visual heritage, not critically, no critique of colonialism or wars, just statements to the effect that we're grateful for the visual resources that colonialism bequeaths to us as Afghans. And we see just the repetition on a national scale of imperial visuality. In addition to war, and post 9/11, it is war. It's a global war of unlimited scale. It's an experimental military zone with all kinds of marginally legal activities, renditions, black sites, etc. And the business of war has its own imagery, we'll see in a second, but the humanitarian actors also have their own imagery. Those dealing with droughts and food and other sorts of issues also have a visual repertoire for a different audience, produced differently than local images, again, because they circulate and have intentions that are different. It's climate change, and I'm inspired really by some of the images in the pamphlet to attend to not just climate change, but the rampant pollution in Afghanistan. Deglaciation is a major problem. And the solution apparently is to build more dams in Afghanistan. And we've got a serious water problem that brings in a lot of satellite imagery and NASA and kind of intelligence sequestering of visual data that prohibit academic analysis of the problem of climate change, for example. Pollution, again, following on one of the pictures. Kabul is one of the most polluted cities in the world. This is the environmental impact of war. This is two-stroke diesel military engine fuel percolating in the valley of Kabul. The American visual imperium, if you were to look at the Department of Defense Flickr site or the State Department's, we have thousands. In 1914, Max Fort, looked at 10,000 images. And if you looked at those images, you'd think that the war in Afghanistan is all about giving kids candy, playing with them, and sort of hugging children. And these images get circulated in municipal newspapers, national media, and globally through Facebook and social media. This is propaganda, visual propaganda. I suggest we need a resistance to that propaganda. I suggest we focus on the environmental impact of war. In this case, it's the mother of all bombs dropped in Afghanistan. The largest explosion short of nuclear war in April 2017 in the Achin district of Jalalabad, Nangarhar. A nuclear explosion or just short, measured on the Richter scale. Apparently 94 insurgents are killed and no innocents and no damage. I will suggest to you that the environmental consequences of this bomb are above ground, with the destruction of trees, and deforestation is the primary warfare product of global war for 40 years in Afghanistan. But it is the depleted uranium that is stocked into this munition and other munitions used in Afghanistan, beginning with Tora Bora in the fall of 2001 until today, 20 years of depleted uranium being deposited into the soil and groundwater of Afghanistan, where we know anecdotally this is poisoning the environment. This is poisoning the future habitation prospects for Afghanistan. Depleted uranium in the groundwater is the primary effect of these munitions. Now, this is not at all discussed. However, it is discussed in the context of the same kinds of munitions in Iraq, Fallujah, Iraq. There is abundant imagery online of human birth defects, and I'm not showing you those because they're really hard to sleep with. But the prevalence of birth defects among the citizens of Afghanistan, the population of Afghanistan, among the animals of Afghanistan, among the botanical genetic supply of Afghanistan is devastating. And we need visual accountability for that to get at a kind of remedy that the wildlife and every living thing in Afghanistan deserves as a basis of this imperial war. I'll close my presentation with that. I'm sorry for going over. I hope I've stopped sharing my screen, Genevieve.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation.